Well, hey there, I'm Joshua Johnson. It's great to be with you on this Wednesday, June 8th. And tonight, we're talking about the lives undone by gun violence.
Do you feel safe at school? Why not?
Because I don't want it to happen again.
Do you think it's going to happen again?
Today, Congress heard some gut-wrenching survivor stories from Uvalde, Texas, and Buffalo, New York, the latest effort in the push for new gun laws. Meanwhile, the House is taking action on age limits for weapons and on high-capacity magazines. But what chance do these measures stand in the Senate? Also tonight, we are awaiting live remarks from President Biden at the Summit of the Americas in Los Angeles. We'll have more on what will happen there and on the world leaders who are not there. Plus, a special diet is helping some diabetes patients get off of their expensive medications. We'll show you in our special series, Beyond the Scale. Hey, let's start tonight on Capitol Hill because just a few minutes ago, the House passed a package of gun legislation. It's called H.R. 7910, the Protecting Our Kids Act. It includes red flag law incentives for states, and it raises the legal age to purchase a semi-automatic rifle from 18 to 21, among other things that you see on the screen. Now, this bill passed mostly along party lines, 223 to 204. 5 Republicans voted yes, 2 Democrats voted no, and now the measure heads to the Senate. This all comes after a day of testimonies from survivors and families of victims from the Buffalo and Uvalde shootings. We brought that to you today here on NBC News Now. They appeared before the House Oversight Committee. The witnesses included Zanetta Everhart. She's the mother of a Buffalo shooting victim. 11-year-old Uvalde survivor Mia Cerrillo, and the parents of 10-year-old Lexi Rubio, also a victim of the Uvalde shooting. Fair warning, their words might just break your heart.
When I went to the barracks, he shot my friend that was next to me, and I thought he was going to come back to the room, so I grabbed the blood and put it all over me.
San Antonio firefighter eventually gave us a ride back to the Civic Center, where the district was asking all families who had not been reunited with their children to gather. Soon after, we received the news that our daughter was among the 19 students and 2 teachers that died as a result of gun violence. Somewhere out there, there's a mom listening to our testimony, thinking, I can't even imagine their pain, not knowing that our reality will one day be hers, unless we act now.
Meanwhile, a growing group of bipartisan Senate negotiators met today. You see them there on the screen. Their goal was to get on the same page about gun reform proposals, but they said they were skeptical about reaching a deal this week or even in the next couple of weeks. Let's begin tonight with Ruquan Brown, an anti-gun violence activist with March for Our Lives. He's also a rising junior at Harvard. Mr. Brown, welcome.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Did anything you heard today from the House committee strike you in particular? I don't know how much of it you got to hear, but did anything in particular stand out to you?
I think that what we're most excited about with everything that's going on in the House is our representatives, our politicians coming together on something. Americans are really afraid for our lives, young people, old people alike. And so it's amazing to see Democrats, Republicans be willing to discuss these things. And that's what we want to continue to happen, because safety, peace is what we all are about. That's what we need. And Democrat and Republican is not the most important thing in the conversation right now. And so we're happy to see that.
A lot of the impact of the testimony today is just hearing what people deal with when gun violence affects their lives firsthand. Tell us a little bit about how gun violence has affected your life for people who may not be familiar with you.
Well, I've been dealing with gun violence since I was 5 years old. I lost a family friend in Seattle when I was 5, and my granddad was shot in the head when I was 6. I had experienced more and more gun violence in between there, and my cousin, Corey Dooley, was shot when I was 12 years old by his stepfather when he was 15. Living in Washington, D.C., I experienced a ton more gun violence. By the time when I turned 16, my stepfather was murdered, and my teammate was murdered the year before. And I can name more people. But what I really want to point out to those that are listening is the gut-wrenching, heart-wrenching, life-taking feeling that those of us who are survivors experience. And it's something that we shouldn't have to experience. It's something that, as Americans, we should have the liberty, the freedom to actually live, and for our family and friends to live as well.
Talk about what that process was like in terms of dealing with an array of gun violence over the course of your relatively young life, and how that affects what comes after. All these families who are talking about what they went through in Buffalo and Uvalde, they're just kind of at the beginning of a process that you, unfortunately, have had to go through for a while.
Yeah, I mean, it's a never-ending process, too. I've been in therapy for 3 years, and that helps, but I still have nightmares of myself and my family being murdered. And that's a reality that a lot of us share. I heard the Uvalde teacher who lost all of his students speak. He says that he may never be able to go into a classroom again. And that's the same feeling I feel when I'm driving through the city that my stepfather was murdered in. That's the same feeling I feel when I walk down the street that my mentee was murdered on. That's the same feeling I feel when I walk by the bus stop that my teammate was murdered at. How am I supposed to live freely and dream and imagine life if everywhere I go I'm reminded of death? And the death, not that is by chance, but the death that so forcefully encapsulates all Americans, but so rapidly and so normally Black Americans.
Yeah, that was one of the interesting things about the hearing today, as we heard from a number of people who come from communities of color, not just from East Buffalo, where this supermarket shooting happened, but communities of color that have been ripped apart by gun violence for a very long time. Let me ask you about where we go from here. We heard today from a man named Greg Jackson Jr., who's the executive director of a group called the Community Justice Action Fund. And this is part of what he said today in terms of what needs to be done, in his view, about guns in America. Watch.
We need are real investments in our communities, real investments in prevention strategies that we know work, and we need someone to stand up against the flood of firearms that are pouring into our communities. Guns don't grow on trees. We are not creating these guns. They are being flooded into our communities, and the gun industry is profiting off of our death every single day.
What do you see in terms of a path forward to talk about just the presence of guns in the U.S.? That always begins down that slippery slope of saying, see, they want to take our guns away. They want to, prevent lawful gun owners from owning guns. And that seems like where the conversation dies every single time. But how do you see that conversation going now? Is there a way to kind of balance those arguments and find a new way forward?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I think that we're finding that way. I think that it's exciting to be finding that way. One of the things and the freedoms of being an American is that you get to choose what to do. You get to choose which weapons you own. You get to choose which weapons you don't. And that's a beautiful option to have. What we are discussing is gun safety. What we are discussing is responsible gun ownership. What we are discussing is taking care of those who have guns so that they don't feel the need to use their guns to wield power over the people that they are murdering. What we care about is the hearts and souls of not only the murdered, but the murderers, because a lot of people are fueled with hate and violence, and so they're not purchasing guns just for protection. They're purchasing guns for hateful acts, and that's not American, or it shouldn't be. Unfortunately, it has been all too American that we are allowed to commit these atrocities so often, but it shouldn't be. And so I think that beautifully what we have seen is gun owners and anti-gun owners work together to decide that, hey, listen, you and I deserve to be able to go to the grocery store or go to school or go on our university campus and be safe.
Raquan Brown, I appreciate you making time for us tonight. Let me just say, from one man of color to another man of color, I very much appreciate you being open about going to therapy. I know that's not something that brothers like to talk about very much, but I think it's something that maybe someone needed to hear. So for that, I appreciate that, and I appreciate you making time for us tonight. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. I appreciate you. Thank you for having me. And I just want to remind everybody to text 954 or text March to 954 to join us in the march and help with our movement. Also visit my website, loveonebiz.com, to help Black gun violence survivors.
Raquan Brown, much appreciated. Thank you. Still to come, President Biden speaks live in Los Angeles. He's there for the Summit of the Americas. Now, we're waiting for the heads up that he's ready to speak, but when he does, we'll bring it to you live. And tomorrow, the January 6th committee holds its first public hearing in prime time. We'll have a preview. We're glad you're with us for Now Tonight from NBC News. Immigration is a huge issue in the Western Hemisphere, but not the only one. Business development, COVID prevention, protecting the environment. Plenty to talk about at this year's Summit of the Americas. It's about to begin in Los Angeles now that President Biden has arrived. The U.S. has not hosted this diplomatic summit since 1994. That one was held in Miami during the Clinton administration. Now, we are awaiting live remarks from the president. We'll bring those to you live when they happen. This summit takes place every few years. The host country picks the guest list, and this year, that got controversial. The U.S. did not invite Cuba, Nicaragua, or Venezuela. Officials cited concerns over democracy and human rights violations. And that did not sit well with Mexico's president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador. He is skipping the event, sending the foreign minister in his place. Before the president speaks, let's get the latest on the summit. Joining us now are LA Times reporter Tracy Wilkinson, and Anusha Rasta is a reporter for our station KNBC in Los Angeles. Anusha, let me start with you near the summit. Tell us what the atmosphere has been like on the ground and outside the venue as we get ready for the summit to start.
Well, Joshua, as you can imagine, security here is very tight, a heavy law enforcement presence. Of course, a lot of police officers, Secret Service, barricades, a lot of street closures. Downtown Los Angeles is a very congested area, as you already know. So this is, of course, adding to the hustle and bustle and just how hectic things are here. So far, very calm. The process has been fairly smooth for us, from our perspective, to go from event to event. As you know, there are a lot of summit-related events happening around LA today. I do want to mention there are protesters, several groups of protesters. Everything has remained peaceful and calm. You can imagine with the heavy police presence, there's obviously supervision over these protesters, but there are large groups of Salvadorans, Nicaraguans who are protesting against the dictatorships in their countries. We've seen folks protesting about immigration issues. Of course, President Biden is facing a lot of important problems that are happening in the country right now. Inflation being one of them. You know, folks very concerned about gas prices. In LA County, we've seen some gas stations charging $8 a gallon for a gallon of regular gas. You've got the supply chain problems. You've got the baby formula shortages. So a lot of folks here with different types of concerns, but for the most part, when we're talking about Latin American countries and citizens from those countries, I think the focus really is on the dictatorships and the want and the need for the United States to help with those problems.
Yeah, and we'll see how much the president or the rest of the U.S. delegation talks about those issues. By the way, with regard to what Anusha was just saying, in terms of security around the event, we have not heard much about incidents, although we did just get word of one woman who was detained by LAPD. She might have thrown something at part of the presidential motorcade, but it doesn't look like anything more has come of that in particular. Tracy Wilkinson, let me ask you about part of what the administration is expected to talk about. We're expecting the president to talk about something called the Action Plan on Health and Resilience in the Americas, basically addressing the impacts of COVID on the Americas. What more do we know about that?
Yes, well, I think the COVID pandemic really dramatized in Latin America, as it actually did in the United States as well, that there is such a division, a disparity between those who have access to health care and those who don't, you know, the inequality of health care. And so I think a lot of the Latin American leaders who are coming here are trying to talk to the United States about a broader consensus or cooperation in terms of, you know, vaccine cooperation, how all of these countries can, better coordinate diagnosis, treatment, etc. And so, in fact, I spoke to the Colombian health minister today, and he was talking about, what we've gone through is really the trial run for the next pandemic, because of course it is expected that this kind of health crisis is going to continue, but that these countries really want to have a better way to deal with it. And with the United States, cooperate better in terms, as I said, of vaccine access and similar scientific sharing.
Anusha, you kind of touched on this a second ago when you gave us some of the color from the ground, but how much, if at all, are people who are there at the summit, particularly outside, concerned about the absence of Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela? You mentioned that they were concerned about some of the dictatorships in Latin America, including some that are represented in that room. But I'm just wondering if folks on the ground where you are looking at the same things that people from farther away are looking at, or if their focus is different.
Well, we've seen both, right? We've seen folks whose focus is on the immigration issues, on more of the personal experiences with the immigration process in this country and the way that that's happened for them or their loved ones. But we've also seen concern that other world leaders were not invited to this summit. Of course, President Biden's goal here is to show leadership and to address these issues that he needs partnerships with other countries, climate change, right? Issues about immigration, economic relationships. And so that does create sort of a problem, I think, from the perspective of folks who are worried about this, right? That type of work can't be done when you're excluding certain countries. But then, of course, you've got the protesters who are worried and concerned and upset that in Nicaragua, in Venezuela, they've got dictators there. They're upset about how the government is being run. They're saying that they're fed up with it. So I think it's a combination of both, but certainly that snub, right, that we're talking about with Mr. Obrador, that's also, of course, a topic of conversation among people here. Other countries sending lower level ranking members as a result. That's sort of how they're dealing with that snub and how they're reacting to it. So I think it's really a combination with folks who are here. It's on both sides, right? They've got concerns just across the board. But yes, that is one of them.
We are looking live in Los Angeles, where President Biden should be speaking momentarily to open the Summit of the Americas. As we mentioned, the U.S. has not hosted this event in almost 2 decades, and since 1994, back when it was held in Miami. We're just waiting on the heads up that President Biden is going to speak, and when he does, we'll bring that to you live. We noted that Venezuela is one of the nations that was not invited. Also, we should note that the president did have a call with the interim president of Venezuela, Juan Guaido. You may remember that Venezuela was ripped apart by protests over its presidential election, where Mr. Guaido was considered the legitimate leader, but the government in power would not give power up. And the president basically reaffirmed its support for Guaido and for the Venezuelan people to have a democratic say in the future of their country. Tracy, with regard to immigration, Vice President Kamala Harris is responsible for handling much of that. What's the outlook from the administration and from everyone else, really, in terms of how much they can get done, especially since some of the key players in that conversation are not there, and since Mexico's president has decided to skip it?
Yeah, it's a really hard task for Kamala Harris, because she doesn't really have partners to deal with. She was told to talk to the so-called Northern Triangle, which is Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. But the leaders there are not particularly interested in talking about these issues, and so she's sort of in a pickle. And it seems like you're trying to have a huge conference here of all of Latin America, and some of the major countries that are involved in immigration are not coming. Mexico, it's not clear to this day whether several of the Central American countries are coming, and so it's really left kind of in this, no man's land of inability to do anything really about the issue of immigration, which has constantly been the tough road to hoe, because they talk about root causes of immigration from Central America. And this is something, they've been talking about for decades. And, poverty, corruption, all of the things that propel people to leave Central America are not being resolved. And I'm not sure they can be resolved on any kind of short-term basis. And so, that's where that stands. And that is where, Kamala Harris, frankly, and much of this, of the Biden administration cannot really do very much to change things.
Well, we'll keep an eye on the stage in Los Angeles for the president's arrival. There'll probably be some pageantry and introductions. We'll get a 2-minute warning before he goes on stage, and we'll try to bring you that live as quickly as we can. But for now, Tracy Wilkinson of the Los Angeles Times and KNBC's Anusha Rasta joining us from outside of the convention center. We appreciate you both making time for us tonight. Thank you very much. And please stay with us. We'll bring you the president's remarks as soon as we can, if we can. Coming up, what we know now about January 6th. Tomorrow, the House committee will begin revealing its findings in a prime-time hearing. More on what we can expect just ahead. Stay close. You are looking live at the entrance of President Biden and the First Lady, Dr. Jill Biden, arriving at the Summit of the Americas in Los Angeles. He is going to make an address to formally open the event at the inaugural ceremony, with lots on the agenda: immigration, dealing with COVID-19 and other issues. They're still going through some of the pomp and the pageantry. We'll let you know when the president actually starts speaking, and when he does, we will bring that to you live. The House committee investigating the January 6th attack always had two big questions hanging over it. What will we really learn, and what difference will it make? Tomorrow night, we may get some answers. The committee will hold its first public hearing at 8 p.m. Eastern. These first public findings come after more than 1,000 witnesses and almost 100 subpoenas. This week, committee member Jamie Raskin suggested that its investigation will lay a lot of questions to rest.
The Select Committee has found evidence about a lot more than incitement here, and we are going to be laying out the evidence about all of the actors who were pivotal to what took place on January 6th. The idea that all of this was just a rowdy demonstration that spontaneously got a little bit out of control is absurd. You don't almost knock over the U.S. government by accident.
In a moment, we will preview what you can expect tomorrow. But first, NBC News Now anchor Hallie Jackson has more on how we got here.
It's a day that nearly brought America to its knees. An attack on the Capitol after former President Trump's lies that the 2020 election was stolen. It was not.
We're going to walk down to the Capitol, and we're going to cheer on our brave senators and congressmen and women, and we're probably not going to be cheering so much for some of them.
Angry rioters clashing with police, breaching the Capitol steps, going inside the building to try to stop the counting of electoral votes that would officially make Joe Biden the president. 5 people died, 2 of whom were officers who died by suicide after the insurrection, and about 140 people were hurt, with $1.5 million worth of damages to the Capitol building itself. Across the country, shock and, at first, fury. And at the Capitol, a new committee created intending to investigate and report on what led up to what they called the domestic terrorist attack on the Capitol. The committee's creation, controversial, with many Republicans decrying it as overly partisan and Democrats insisting it is a fact-finding mission. Ultimately, 7 Democrats and 2 Republicans began their work in late July of 2021 with public testimony from 4 police officers who defended the Capitol on January 6th.
We simply want justice and accountability. For most people, January 6th happened for a few hours. But for those of us who were in the thick of it, it has not ended.
Since then, the committee has conducted more than 1,000 depositions and interviews behind closed doors, received more than 140,000 documents, and issued 98 public subpoenas. Some complied with the subpoenas, like some members of the Trump family and former White House aides.
Former White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows did not testify at deposition scheduled by the House committee investigating that Capitol riot.
Others refused to testify, like former White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows and former White House aides Steve Bannon, Peter Navarro, and Dan Scavino. All four have since been held in contempt of Congress for refusing to testify.
Former Trump aide Steve Bannon indicted for contempt of Congress.
Bannon and Navarro were also indicted by a federal grand jury for contempt of Congress, both refusing to provide the committee with documents or testimony. The committee, more recently, escalating its investigation by subpoenaing members of Congress.
They just issued subpoenas to 5 sitting members of Congress, including the House Republican leader, Kevin McCarthy.
But all 5 of those members have declined to testify so far.
They're not conducting a legitimate investigation. It seems as though they just want to go after their political opponents.
So what are the committee's big revelations to this point? First, text messages showed members of Congress, journalists, and even members of the president's own family begging Mark Meadows to tell former President Trump to stop the insurrection. Messages initially obtained by CNN. Second, the committee found a more than 7-hour gap in White House phone logs during the riot when they know former President Trump had been in touch with Republican lawmakers like Leader McCarthy and Alabama Senator Tommy Tuberville.
That was NBC's Hallie Jackson reporting. Now let's preview tomorrow's hearing. NBC Capitol Hill correspondent Ali Rafa joins us now with more on that. Ali, what can we expect tomorrow?
Yeah, Joshua, well, these hearings that kick off tomorrow will be the culmination of almost a year of exhaustive work by this committee. We have heard from members who say to expect this as sort of the first day of a legal trial. We expect some compelling sound from several testimonies, including one by a documentarian who we know was embedded with the Proud Boys outside of the Capitol on January 6th. He is expected to present some never-before-seen video to this committee, as well as the American people. We also expect to hear from a U.S. Capitol Police officer who was injured and was radioing for her colleagues to come help her as she was defending the front line of barricades as those thousands of people started to swarm the Capitol. She was later diagnosed with a brain injury by the end of the day. We also expect to hear from several pre-recorded depositions of people who haven't publicly spoken about the events on January 6th, like Ivanka Trump, her husband Jared Kushner. And so this is really the culmination of the work by this committee to present the findings that you mentioned, those thousands of pieces of evidence, those hundreds of people that they've interviewed, to really set the stage as to what happened on January 6th, how things were allowed to get that bad that quickly, and setting it juxtaposed to a Trump White House that was trying to overturn the results of the 2020 election, Joshua.
And Ali, briefly, the fact that this is happening at 8 p.m. in prime time is significant in terms of the tone that the committee wants to set and the way that it wants to make its case. And that's gotten a little controversial, at least with Republicans, many of whom did not take part in the committee.
Yeah, this is a bipartisan committee, but it is bipartisan because of 2 Republican members, Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, who broke with their party to join this committee. And we're starting to hear the messaging from Republicans and how that's differing even among Republicans in the same party. We're starting to hear, they've slammed this committee from its inception, really, calling it a, quote, witch hunt, calling it corrupt. And we're starting to hear the same already before these hearings even start, some of them calling this political theater and partisan. There's also a subgroup of Republicans that basically is thinking that the American people have already moved on from this, that it happened over a year ago now. And they're saying that just bringing it up again will just bring new light to it, and they're saying it's not even worth it. Others are saying that they're going to be countering every revelation that's revealed through these hearings with news conferences and several interviews that we expect to see over the next few weeks, Joshua.
Thank you, Ali. That's NBC's Ali Rafa previewing tomorrow's hearing with the January 6th committee. And of course, you can watch that hearing here at 8 p.m. Eastern at this time on NBC News Now. We are still waiting for President Biden to make his remarks. He is in Los Angeles at the Summit of the Americas. As soon as his remarks begin, we will bring those to you. You can see that they're going through some opening ceremonies now, but we'll get to the president's remarks as soon as he takes the podium. Tonight's headlines begin in eastern Ukraine, where Russian attacks have continued to intensify. Ukrainian troops may soon retreat from the key eastern city of Severodonetsk. That's according to the region's governor. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is calling the Donbas region, in his words, the epicenter of confrontation. There you see we've got Severodonetsk marked on the right side of the map in that large red area. That city is the last major city in that region that Ukraine still controls, so losing it would be a huge strategic blow. Meanwhile, concerns are growing about a global food crisis. Russia is still blocking Ukrainian ports. Today, Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov met with Turkey's Foreign Minister to discuss the matter. The two countries expressed support for a corridor in the Black Sea to resume food exports. But Ukraine has rejected that proposal, calling Mr. Lavrov's words empty. They say they need a military presence in the Black Sea to defend themselves against Russian advances. NBC's Ali Arouzi has more now from Kyiv. Hey, Ali.
Hey, Joshua. Well, the battle on Ukraine's eastern front continues to rage. The Russians are determined to take the whole Donbas area, and their axis of fighting right now is focused on the Luhansk area, and they want to take Severodonetsk, the capital of that region. And they've been pounding it day and night for weeks now. But it's been, as you and I have spoken about, an ebb and flow. The Russians have made some grounds, and then they got pushed back by the Ukrainians. Now, the Ukrainians had said a couple of days ago that they had captured a lot of the territory that they had lost to the Russians at the first weeks of the war. But once they positioned themselves in those territories, the Russians started with relentless missile attacks and artillery on those troops, and the governor of the Luhansk area said that those troops had to move back from those areas because if they stayed there, they would have simply been slaughtered by Russian artillery. And the Russians are saying now that they are determined to take that place as soon as Friday, possibly, because they really need to sell this back home as a big win to show that they've got the momentum on their side and they're advancing their front line further and further west into Ukraine. And of course, Joshua, all of this fighting is taking a huge toll on the innocent civilian population. We went to Bordyanka today, which is a town near Bucha where all those terrible war crimes were committed by the Russians, and we had an opportunity to speak to Maria. She's a 77-year-old grandmother who lived in an area with her daughter, her son-in-law, and her grandchildren. When the Russians started shelling that area, they had to take cover in the basement of an apartment building. And the shells kept landing, and one of those shells hit the bunker where they were sitting, and it crushed her daughter and her son-in-law to death in front of them. Thankfully, she survived and her grandchildren survived, but their lives were torn apart by this attack. Her grandchildren now live in Poland. She has no home. She's living in temporary housing set up by the Polish, and she was just an emotional wreck telling us what she had gone through. Let's take a listen to what she had to say.
She has nowhere to live, and she lost her children, and she doesn't know how to live her life, and her grandchildren are small. So can you imagine what I outlived in the month and a half? Every day I was washing my face with my tears.
And Joshua, just walking around that area, it was total devastation and carnage. But Maria would always go back and visit her home to document what had happened to it, to feed the stray cats there. But the carnage was unbelievable. And beyond that, the stench of death was still very prevalent there. The Russians may have quit that area weeks ago, but the trauma and the devastation stuck out there. And, you know, us and our crew were walking around there, and you could smell it. It could have been dead bodies. It could have been dead animals. We're not sure. But whatever it was still decaying there. And these folks have to still live with that, even though the Russians have gone.
Wow. Thank you, Ali. That's NBC's Ali Arouzi with the latest from Kyiv. President Trump is preparing to testify in an investigation related to his businesses. New York's Attorney General Letitia James has reached an agreement with the former president's legal team. The state is looking into his various business dealings as part of a civil investigation. At issue is whether the Trump organization inflated its financial statements. Under the agreement, the president, Donald Jr., and Ivanka Trump will all testify on Friday, July 15th. They have until the end of the following week to finish their depositions, and they will testify separately from each other. Olympic gymnasts Simone Biles and Aly Raisman are among the sexual assault victims seeking more than $1 billion from the FBI. The group claims that the Bureau mishandled its investigation into former U.S. Olympic team Dr. Larry Nassar. Today, they filed federal tort claims. The documents detail a year in which they claim that no meaningful investigative action was taken. Most of the women say Dr. Nassar abused them after he had already been reported to the FBI in 2015. U.S. Olympic team gymnast Michaela Maroney is one of the 90 women seeking damages. She wrote in a statement, quote, "My fellow survivors and I were betrayed by every institution that was supposed to protect us. The U.S. Olympic Committee, USA Gymnastics, the FBI, and now the Department of Justice," unquote. Today's filing was not the first of its kind, but it is the largest and includes the most prominent of Nassar's accusers. 13 other victims filed similar claims against the FBI in April. 37 million Americans have diabetes, nearly all type 2. In tonight's installment of our special series, Beyond the Scale, we explore a new approach to reverse type 2 diabetes. Here's NBC's Kate Snow.
Keelaf Sharp always thought he was in pretty good shape. He's a personal trainer and realtor in Birmingham, Alabama. But type 2 diabetes runs in his family.
My grandmother had diabetes, my mom, my sister has it.
Keelaf was so busy, he used to grab fast food, sweet tea, energy drinks.
People see you and think, oh, you work out, you're healthy, there's nothing wrong with you. No, that's not the case.
Not if you're not eating right.
Exactly.
A few years ago, he was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes and prescribed medicine. But Keelaf wanted alternatives, so he volunteered for a study at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, looking at 2 diets. Keelaf was put on a low-carb diet for 3 months. Every Tuesday, a box of food arrived with recipes.
So it's eggs with vegetables. You can put whatever vegetables you want in. No carbs.
I think we'll go with the 3 hours.
Nutrition researcher Barbara Gower launched the study 5 years ago.
Americans tend to eat a lot of sugar and carbohydrates, and you reach a limit to the ability to store those excess calories. And that essentially is what ultimately leads to type 2 diabetes.
The white that we're seeing here is the fat in between the organs?
That's right.
The key to Gower's study, targeting the fat around organs like the pancreas and liver.
When someone has diabetes, they no longer have the ability to really metabolize carbohydrates correctly. And we feel that they're converting a lot of those carbohydrates to harmful fats that are stored in and around the organs. So we're taking those carbohydrates out of the diet with the idea that if we do that, we may be able to allow the body to recover.
Could that potentially reverse type 2 diabetes?
Yes, it could.
The results so far are promising.
For decades, people have been on medication for type 2 diabetes. Could this be a wholesale change in how you look at it?
Oh, it absolutely could be. I am convinced that we can treat individuals with type 2 diabetes with diet.
Today, Keelaf is no longer considered diabetic, and he's found creative ways to satisfy his sweet tooth.
I may take a chocolate protein shake and eat some almonds, and to me it was a Hershey's almond bar.
New habits he plans to keep.
That was NBC's Kate Snow reporting. Hey, remember to join Lester Holt tomorrow for live special coverage of the January 6th committee hearings. Our special report begins at 7:30 p.m. here on NBC News Now. I will be back on Friday, but until we meet again, I'm Joshua Johnson. Thank you for making time for us. Good night.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.